Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Alexander the Great went west. I already made a video explaining how Alexander the Great was having his empire and how his empire would survive for a long time. So if you're interested in this video, please feel free to check out. The link is in the description box. Anyways, Alexander the Great, he had many good reasons to go to the east. Persia was the main enemy of the Greeks. Persia had also many legends and myths around richness and many other things. And Persia was also a huge empire. So Persia was the cherry on the top of a cake. Fighting it and beating it was a huge prestigious thing. Now it would seem almost impossible for Alexander the Great to go to the west, because after conquering Persia he continued his route until the Indus River and he had plans to circumnavigate the Arabian Peninsula. Anyways, let's see what we can do to get Alexander the Great to go to the west. First of all, let's define the west. I mean, nowadays we have a concrete idea about what the west is, but I'm talking about mainly western and south, more like southwestern Europe. If you take a map of the Western Roman Empire, we would already have a basic idea of where Alexander the Great would go. But let's also take away Britain, Gaul, Germania and even Pannonia, or nowadays Hungary. Let's also not forget that we have Greek colonies in Italy, France, Spain, and we even have Illyria and the Etruscans, who might not really have been an empire or so per se, but they had a system and they had some cultural coherence. Iberia might be a wild card in here, but the coast would definitely be targeted in one way or another. Now let's come to Carthage. Carthage was a rich trade empire, and if the Greeks would somehow get word about rich Carthaginian ports and how Carthage was trying to sabotage the Greeks and do only trades with the Persians, well, the Greeks would be at odds with the Carthaginians, or at least you could somehow fuel these emotions into hatred for the Carthaginians. Rome was not really a big player yet. All in all, if Alexander the Great had the same skills and the same luck, he would be able to take on the West easily. Let's say before taking on Persia, Alexander the Great would want to accomplish something else: the unification of all Greeks. Now, of course, this idea might be more a nationalistic idea, but hear me out. In this scenario, Alexander the Great, he would use this unification to have a full force to beat the Persians. So this would not really be a nationalistic ideal, the megali idea, but it would be more of a defensive idea in order to combat the Persians. And hearing about Carthage and how rich they were, he would also take a huge interest in that. It would definitely be an asset for future battles with the Achaemenid Empire. Speaking of the Achaemenid Empire, they were already in a bad spot, and many subject kingdoms were rebelling and not following orders of Persepolis. The Achaemenid Empire would still face troubles, and Darius III was not a competent leader, unfortunately, and therefore the Achaemenid Empire would leave Alexander the Great as for now, as they were just too busy with their own internal policies. Alexander's first point would be to convince some of the former Greek colonies to join him. This would be done diplomatically, and at the same time he would want to save the northern borders and thus would make a first conquest of Illyria. The morale was pretty low at the beginning because they wouldn't fight the Persians immediately, so the soldiers would also have some questions about the idea of why they would do this, but his tactics seemed to work out perfectly. And this would also give a boost of the morale of the soldiers, and supplies would come much faster as there was no need for ships and so on. In the meantime, some Greek colonies would join Alexander while other colonies would not do so. This would be the second step. Alexander would either conquer them or just install a puppet tyrant. Only Greek colony would be a problematic one, and that's Syracuse. And Carthage would then intervene. I can imagine that Carthage would have the advantage on sea because, well, they are Carthage, but they would have no advantage on land. The naval tradition of some Greek cities, such as Athens for instance, would be supported heavily, and with the tactics of Alexander the Great, the Greeks would not only outnumber the Carthaginians, but they would also have their own people fighting against the mercenaries of Carthage. Some mercenaries, they could even join the Greeks, or they would be bribed to join them. And that would make Carthage forcefully part of the alliance of Alexander the Great, because right now we would not have an empire per se. Little by little, Massilia and the Greek colonies in Spain would become part two, and I think that in around 5 years or so, calculating the distances he made in OTL with Persia, he would have a pretty united Mediterranean alliance under his wing. Alexander's new alliance or empire would rely more on the navy, as in OTL, and the soldiers would be bigger in numbers, and the generals as well as the armies, they would have more experience. Moreover, Alexander the Great never went to India, and as a consequence he would live much longer. With all the chaos within the Achaemenid Empire, it is too difficult to predict what would happen within 5 years, but a consolidation phase would be totally out of question, and thus Alexander might have an even bigger chance in conquering all of the Achaemenid Empire or huge chunks of it. With the alliance around the Mediterranean and the news that Persia would be beaten, I imagine that Alexander would not go until the Indus River. He would probably be called back in the western part of his empire or sphere of influence. Some allies would want to gain independence, hearing that Persia is now finally taken out, and with Alexander still in power, this would obviously not happen, and the opposition would be crushed. Alexander the Great would now not only have a much bigger prestige than in OTL, but people would fear him. Although 1 or 2 sporadic rebellions might still happen, but the rebellions, they were nothing too worrisome and would be dealt with easily. Alexander the Great would be considered by some even a god, as he would almost conquer all of the known world, even more so than he did in OTL. He would have to focus his attention towards internal policies and keeping his empire or alliance system together. I can imagine that he would want to rule all of the Greek states and parts of Persia, all of Babylonia, Anatolia, Illyria and Egypt directly, while creating client kingdoms or vassal states in Rome, Carthage and the outmost parts of Persia, the Caucasus and Iberia. If Alexander would continue with the Persian tradition of the royal road and the Carthaginian tradition of maritime trade, he could repurpose these elements in order to establish communication lines from the west to the east, and with the capital of Macedon or the Kingdom of Macedon, it could become a real capital, because later on with the Etruscan influence in architecture we would also have great influence of constructions and aqueducts, paved roads and so on. They would become everywhere a reality, but certainly more so in the western part and in the capital. Plus, if we look at the map, if you would take all of Iberia until all of Persia, Greece might almost be in the middle between these two geographies, and also we would have an influx from west and east. We would have more Greeks coming, Etruscans, Romans, Carthaginians, Persians, and many more people from faraway places where they would like to do trade in Pella, or they would be hired to work in the administration, they would be hired to become translators, they would do so many works, and this would make Pella into a world capital. With that said, Alexander would certainly not want to, Alexander would certainly want to achieve one great thing. It might not be the conquest of India or even China, but the circumnavigation of Arabia would become a reality. And with that, other ideas would flow in his mind, but even someone as great as Alexander has his limits. More focus would be set on internal policies, and his generals would probably like to get some type of power, be it by ruling some domains, and the most dangerous generals would be sent really far away in eastern Persia or western Iberia. More loyal generals, they might form a type of council, and other noteworthy people would rule a satrap, a province, or a city as a strategos. Later on, the empire of Alexander the Great could go two ways. Of course, it might just fall apart as it did in OTL, and it would even create a much bigger chaos, and in there I'm really not sure what to expect of it, so that's how far this point of divergence would go. Or it might have a higher chance in surviving many more years, uniting the Middle East with the Mediterranean, and even later on North Africa and Western Europe permanently, in a cultural point of view. Alexander's empire might even become something like Rome in this alternative timeline. And people after hundreds of years would consider themselves to be descendants of the Alexandrines or Macedonians, although I would not choose this word, but let's say they are Alexandrines or Alexandrians, with many strategos, because there will be no Caesar or Kaiser, claiming that they are direct descendants of Alexander the Great. With so many butterflies, places like India especially would also undergo a very different path. This world would be unrecognizable. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.